Thank you so much for being here today. I know you have a very busy schedule, and we really thank you for taking this time out. Let's start from your childhood days. You were brought up and raised in Hyderabad. Your mother was a professor. She has a PhD in American literature, and your father in plastics. Tell me, how did your journey gear towards engineering?
Well, Reshma, thank you so much for having me on your show. It's such a pleasure to be here. You're right, I do consider myself a Hyderabadi. I was born in Bombay, but grew up in Hyderabad, spent all my life there. And I think education was always deemed to be really important in my family. My father studied in the US before he went back to run his own business in India. My brother attended grad school here as well in the US. And as you said, my mother was a professor of American literature. She studied Carl Sandburg and Ogden Nash. And the last thing I wanted to be was the least educated person in the family. But in those days in India, growing up, you either did engineering or you did medicine, as you know, if you wanted to be successful. And the sight of blood was terrifying, and so I did engineering. And in some sense, it was following my father's footsteps and my brother's footsteps because both of them were engineers.
So, what was the initial transition like from India to here?
Well, I did my undergrad degree in what was called electronics in India, electrical engineering. And in my final semester, I studied computer science in India, and I really loved computers. And so I applied for a master's in computer science, went to a small school in Ohio called Bowling Green State University. And it was fascinating because you suddenly have exposure to all of this computing environment. The grad students typically are fairly motivated, and I loved it. I think the Midwest was a great way for us to get exposed to the U.S., even though I'd grown up in a fairly progressive, setting at home. And my brother insisted that I study really hard because he said I'd get deported unless I studied. So I, applied myself to my books, and it was great. Bowling Green, it was a small set of Indian students, but we all knew each other, and we all really had a great time, both academically as well as socially.
Fantastic. Interesting. So let me take you down memory lane to your college days where you met your lovely wife as well. So what do you reminisce about those days?
Well, I met her in college here. You're
Yes.
absolutely right.
Yeah.
I met her my first day in a small school in Ohio called Bowling Green State University. I think just coming from the US, you get exposed to such wonderful things. And candidly, I don't think I was a very diligent student in India. I participated in debates. I sailed for the country. I did drama. I did all of the extracurricular Vela activities, as opposed to engineering. And so when I came to the U.S., computer science was this brand new field. I was fascinated. My brother told me that if I didn't do well in school, I'd get deported. So I decided I've got to work really hard. But I loved computer science, and I did really well. It was a great, great experience. And the fact that I was switching from electronics to computer science, I actually took a lot of undergrad classes rather than starting with only grad classes. So it felt like my fundamentals, actually were sound for a change.
And tell me about your wife, meeting her, and how did your love story develop?
I'm not sure she wants me to talk about that, Reshma, but you're right. We met in Bowling Green. And, in those days, there weren't very many Indians, right? And so all the Indian grad students hung out together, and, we were very good friends. And then she went on to do her PhD actually at Case Western, and I came to California to both work and pursue graduate studies. And I think, when absence made the heart fonder, I think we decided to get married.
Oh, that's lovely. And you have two very handsome sons. One is in Brown, and the other one just graduated. Are they following in your footsteps?
You're right. I have two boys. Shravan graduated from Stanford and is working for a startup. He loves the ambiguity and uncertainty, and so lives in San Francisco like all kids of his generation. And he actually did math. So unlike his dad, he's good at math and likes math. And so I think, this big data field, that's such a hot field today. And he's a product manager at a startup and just loves it. And Arjun is, he's interning at Facebook, but he's at Brown, and He actually they call it a concentration rather than a major in economics. But he likes the whole idea of entrepreneurship and design, and how do you combine entrepreneurship and design, which I think is also an incredibly important field today. So I would say tangentially related, but not, quite core computer science like I did.
So what about you as a father? If I were to ask them, are you a strict dad?
Well, they're both, you met them, they're both much bigger than me. So I think,
6'4"?
yes, 6'4". So I don't think they would say I was a very strict. I think we're very atypical parents from that point of view. And I think Rennie's done an amazing job of raising them. And I've stayed out of the way. But, they're great kids.
Now let's switch over to your work. You started your career at a young age. You've also worked with Apple. You've stated that Apple actually helped you in your leadership skills. So tell me about those days for you.
Well, my first job was at a startup and a small company called MeasureX Automation Systems. And then after a couple of years, as you point out, I moved to Apple and then Silicon Graphics. And then I co-founded another company called Pictra. And I've been at Adobe now for 19 years. So I've been in tech all my life, Reshma, and I love it because I love building products. And I think every one of those jobs was a great experience. While all may not have been financially great successes, I think if you go into every one of those jobs looking for what you can learn, and I think I learned something from every one of my jobs.
And speaking of Pictra, I believe it was serendipitously that you came across Adobe because you actually wanted to sell your company. Is that true?
Well, Pictra was trying to do image sharing on the web. This was in the 90s, and we thought, wow, people will want to share images and share videos, which, as we know now today, there are tens and tens of companies that do that. And we were pretty early on.
Right.
And Adobe was the leader in digital imaging. I mean, Photoshop was already a household name, and plus there were other products called Photoshop Album and Photoshop Elements. So you're right. As part of the process of who do we partner with or who might be a potential acquirer, I met with Adobe as part of that. And while the technology was actually sold to Fuji, Ross Bott, who at that point ran products for Adobe, and Bruce Chizen, who ran the imaging business and later became CEO, both of them said, why don't you come work for us? And here I am.
Here you are.
Yes.
Now, tell me the first time you heard that you were going to be appointed as CEO of Adobe. What was that feeling like?
It's just been an incredible journey at Adobe. And the truth is, I joined in 98. I was very fortunate. I was promoted in 1999 to actually head up all products. And at the core, Adobe is a product company. So in many ways, being appointed head of products was sort of, you were managing the candy store, right, that we have, because all products were then under my, area of interest. And then, I've had successive promotions. So in 2001, they promoted me to head all products and marketing and president and CEO in 2005. And so, I was assuming as long as I continued to perform that hopefully I'd get the privilege of running the company one day. But the truth is, until you get that affirmation from the board, and, the first call I made was home to tell them that, I am now CEO. It's just an incredible feeling, and it's one that stays with you.
Were you apprehensive at all?
I think the truth is that with all jobs that you do, you're learning as you go. And now if I look back and say, oh my God, the things that I didn't know that I was first going to have to deal with when I was CEO, even though, as I said, Bruce was an incredible partner and he allowed me to do everything. So I did investor relations, I did PR, I did public speaking. But, when you realize, okay, the buck really stops with you, it's different. And I think you rely on a team for everything and you mature, you grow. The things that I know today, I wish I had known 7 years ago, but I didn't. And so.
And would you change anything?
I think you're constantly changing your management style as well. I think you're constantly changing it. I think I'm a consensus builder and I like building consensus, but at the same time, people want you to make decisions. And I would encourage teams to make decisions, but at times you have to make the decision. I think driving change, that's something that I've learned to do. The company's actually gone through a couple of fairly major changes over the last 10 years. And I think the urgency and pace at which you make those changes, I'd probably do those faster in retrospect. You rarely regret doing something. You regret not doing something faster than you actually ended up doing it. And I think that's some of the learning. There's a great friend of mine, John Donahoe, who runs eBay. And one of his lessons is, you can get into the Hall of Fame in baseball batting 300. It's not a cricket analogy for the Indian viewers, but it just means that you fail potentially 7 times out of 10. So this need to say, I'm going to make investments. Some of them are going to pay off, and some of them are not going to pay off. And I think early in your career, you perhaps try and only invest in the things that you think are sureties, and that's not what tech is all about. So I've certainly learned in many areas the importance of people and hiring the best and how you get the best out of them. I'm constantly changing my management style because I think good managers adapt to the people on their team rather than expecting them to adapt to your management style. So hopefully my team would say I'm constantly learning as well.
Absolutely. And, speaking of change, obviously the digital landscape has changed tremendously in the past few years. What would you say are some of the biggest changes that you've seen?
Well, just look at Adobe. I think the world still knows Adobe for any piece of communication that you see. Probably a piece of Adobe software was used to create it. As I said, hopefully you're editing, this show with our products like Premiere, all the special effects that you see with After Effects. Photoshop is certainly a household, word all around the world. But I think what's changing is the adaptation and usage of technology and the pace at which things are moving. And in my career, you expect to see some fundamental changes, but the move towards mobile devices and the move towards the cloud and how social and communities are being used to develop software, seeing all three at the same time, I think that's unprecedented. And in countries like India, I think they're going to completely leapfrog the desktop in many cases and go straight to a mobile first environment. And so I think, everybody's talking about digital transformation. The industries that have been disrupted, whether it's automotive or housing or hoteling, with people with just an application, it's mind-boggling in terms of the pace and the speed at which this is happening all around the world. And I think that's both an advantage as well as a challenge for a company like Adobe.
Absolutely. And speaking of change very fast, you've exponentially grown Adobe under your leadership. What would you say has been your assets in changing this and asserting this?
Well, our number one asset is our people. We're intellectual property people. And as we like to say, all our intellectual property goes home every night. And hopefully they come back the next day because they like working at Adobe. So it's how do you harness the collective power of the creative ideas that exist in the company around a mission that you believe in. So our mission has always been, how do we change the world through digital experiences? We like to think the canvas on which people can innovate around this, with everything that's happening in mobile and all television moving to IP-based networks, there's more power for these people to innovate on a broader scale. And I think our job as leaders is all about how do you harness that power and guide it so that we're helping solve real customer problems.
And who are some of your contemporaries that you look up to?
Well, I mentioned John Donahoe, who did a fabulous job at eBay and PayPal. He took over as CEO about the same time as I did. And, there's sort of this, class off, right, even with CEOs. And the CEOs who took over about the same time in the Valley, I've been fortunate. I know Brad Smith at Intuit, for example, really well. And, you can have a really high bandwidth conversation with these folks, which is you say, hey, I'm thinking through this. And since they have had that shared experience, the ability for them to help you and for you to learn from them and hopefully contribute to them. So, and within Adobe, I would say the management team. We have an incredible team that's, motivated and, really eager to go capture this hill of digital experiences, and it feels good.
Did that come in? Yeah, we need to redo that little part.
Okay.
The door was kind of loud, sorry.
Okay.
But I think just the little last bit, yeah. I think you can pick it up from the management if you'd like.
Sure. And in terms of people who have really helped me, without a doubt, it's Adobe. You spend the most time here. And so, whether it's an individual engineer who's teaching you about the latest technology and what it means, or a product manager who has an idea for a product, or really the entire management team, because we've been on this journey together, and every one of them is helping provide a different perspective. And, you get such immense pleasure from getting all these different perspectives, and how do you then make something out of it?
So in my intro, I say that probably each one of us is using Adobe every single day and not even realizing it. Speaking of the iCloud, you spearheaded that. Tell me, how did that come about?
Well, we spearheaded the Creative Cloud.
Right.
And so I'll just start off as if you said Creative Cloud.
Let me redo that,
Okay.
actually. And speaking of the Creative Cloud, you spearheaded that. How did that come about?
In about 2009, we realized that while everybody in the world used Adobe products, given the pace of innovation that was happening, we had to innovate at a much more rapid pace. The other challenge that we said was we needed to attract new customers to the platform. The business growth was actually slowing down, because everybody used a version of Photoshop. They may not just be using the latest version. And with everything that was happening with mobile devices and everything that was happening to the cloud, we said, is our business model coming in the way of us innovating at the pace at which we need to innovate for our customers? And in that sense, it was an investment in the future, because we had to dramatically reduce our revenue as well as our earnings per share in order to move to this rapid cycle where we could innovate at a faster pace. New cameras come out, Adobe would support it. New devices like an iMac or an iPad Pro or an Android device come out, we could support it. And so the truth is, in all of these big technology transformations, the facts are there. It's the question of what a company does with them. And are you going to try and preserve the status quo, or are you going to make fundamental change? And again, we had this offsite where, as a leadership team, we recognized that there was a much better opportunity for us to serve our customers if we moved to the cloud. Customer satisfaction was disappointing when people went to a store and bought a piece of software and may buy the wrong piece of software for what they were trying to do. And so, it was this journey where we said, people want to create, they all have stories to tell. Why don't we enable them to tell the story wherever they are? Why can't they use a tablet as not just as a consumption device, but as a creation device? So I think painting the picture of what we wanted to do was easy. The hard part was getting the whole company that had been as successful as we were with a particular business model to actually shift to this new business model, and then getting Wall Street, which is a very important stakeholder in any change that you make, to understand why this would be better for our shareholders in the long run. And so the other thing that I think goes by unnoticed sometimes is, all companies that make this change, I think sometimes I get asked the question, did you get this idea one day when you were driving down 280? And the truth is so far from that, right? I mean, you'd use harness the power of 10,000 people to come up with great strategies. And we tried out an experiment in Australia, so we got great feedback, and then that gave us confidence to do it. So again, huge team effort, and now we're correctly, I think, being lauded for being the first company to move to the cloud.
Now, you spearheaded the Creative Cloud. Tell me, how did that come about?
Well, we wanted to completely reimagine the creative process. Adobe had played a role in virtually every kind of content creation, but we thought with what was happening with mobile and what was happening with cloud, there was an ability for us to innovate at a faster pace. And we thought that would appeal even more to the next generation of creatives for whom a subscription model was far more the way they did business rather than a perpetual model. So, the motivations were attracting a new breed of customers, driving far more rapid innovation. And in Silicon Valley, if you're not moving fast, there's always somebody who's going to try and get a piece of your business. And also to build a more recurring business stream. And so we thought that mobile devices would become creation devices as well as consumption devices. And again, as a product company, you wanted to unleash all of the creativity that we had to enable people to tell a story. I think the hard part wasn't about painting this vision of reimagining creative. The hard part was actually the business model transformation and ensuring that Wall Street understood why this would be better for even our shareholders in the long run, because that had never been done before. And the good news is it succeeded, and so I think everybody's now following suit.
But sounds like there was some challenges along the way. So, and obviously life is filled of challenges, and everyone has their trials and tribulations. What would you say were some of your challenging moments in your career?
Well, I think with management, the general truism is that nobody comes to you to make a decision when it's a very obvious decision, right? And so I think as it leads to management or as it relates to leadership, it's all about how do you trust your gut and instinct when you don't have all the facts. And I think the more senior you get, the less facts you have. And so you've got to really trust your instinct. And sometimes you're right and sometimes you're wrong. And getting comfortable also with the fact that you are going to be wrong sometimes is, I think, just part of the leadership journey. So, I don't really look at it as trials and tribulations. I think, maybe that's what I'm a very optimistic person by heart. And I think it's all about how do you learn from the mistakes. If you never try and make mistakes, you're never going to do anything. And, that's certainly not what you have to do in a tech business.
Now, speaking about India and how there's so many hopeful, young, very talented people wanting to come here, what would you suggest to them, a path that you think would be a good path for the next level?
I think what's amazing first is for kids growing up right now, not just in India, but anywhere in the world's their oyster. It used to be in the 80s when I came, as I said, 60% of my graduating class came to the US because all the jobs in tech were in the US. Now, anybody with a computer and access to the internet in Hyderabad or in Bombay or in Delhi can start a business and have a global impact. And that's an absolutely wonderful phenomenon. It used to be Silicon Valley was the only place with access to capital. That's certainly not true anymore. And so, the thing I've always said is, there's so many people who try to plan out their career and I want to do this for 2 years, and I honestly just went with the flow. And if you do something that you're passionate about, that's the biggest piece of advice I would give somebody. Don't listen to me about what I think is the right thing for you. Do something that you're really passionate about, because people excel at things that they're passionate about.
Is that the pearls of wisdom you share with your sons as well?
Well, the good news there is they don't listen to me anyway, so whatever I say. No, it is. And as I said, I think in many ways we're atypical in that they didn't have a very structured, and it was always all about how would they discover what they were good at and what they like to do. And I think too much structure too early in life actually prevents people from exploring. I mean, when I did engineering in India, over 4 years, I think I was allowed to take one elective over 4 years. I mean, these kids, they can do neuroscience and math and economics, and they've learned Hindi. It's just an amazing opportunity to explore, and everybody should take advantage of that if you can.
So I'm going to take you back to the year 2010, when I think it was kind of hard for you, or may have been hard for you, when Steve Jobs came up and talked about and wrote this open letter to Adobe. And you were a young executive. You took it in your stride, handled it very gracefully, and turned the company around. How did you do that?
Well, I think the Apple and Adobe issue at that point had nothing to do with personalities. That had to do with technology and business models. And I think you learn in business not to take things personally. And I'm a pretty even keel kind of person, and so it actually gives you resolve many times to double down on what's the right thing for the company, and that's what we did. When the recession hit in 2009, we said to ourselves, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste, and so how do you galvanize the company, and how do you actually focus on what you think is important? So, as you earlier pointed out, many times in your careers you come at crossroads. And I think how you deal with those crossroads teaches you both something about yourself and your inner resolve. And I think if you continue to focus on what's right, maybe in that sense also, Reshma, the sort of Eastern philosophy of this is a long journey, and so don't worry about any individual race, but focus on the marathon. I think that helps you keep things in perspective. And having a wonderful family also as a support structure makes a big difference.
Absolutely. And so would you say you just stuck to your instincts, and even though they may have been hard times, you still, prevailed, right?
I think we definitely continue to focus on the customer, and we focused on what's the right thing for us in the long run. And whether it's a competitive response, whether it's an economic issue, I think you just have to learn how to power through it, right? And that's what we did.
And speaking of, what are we expecting from Adobe in the near future? Lots of good stuff?
We have just so much opportunity, Reshma. I mean, when we think about the impact we've already had, and the two sort of lines of business that we're in, we call it digital media and digital marketing. The entire world is moving to an online business. When you check into a hotel, when you make a reservation on a plane, when you go and bank with your financial institution, when you get a mortgage, your expectations, or do business with the government, your expectations that you can do this wherever you are in the world using a mobile device. And we are trying to be the back end that empowers all of that digital disruption, enabling people to create a new digital first customer journey. And when you think about education is going to get disrupted, transportation is going to get disrupted, while we may not be the actual brand in front of customers, we're helping every brand transform themselves. And I think it's just started. And so we think that's a massive opportunity. And second, content. There is so much content that's being created in the world, and we want anybody with a story to tell to be able to use an Adobe tool to do that. And last but not least, everybody's going to move from paper to digital. And our PDF technology, which enables you to automate business processes. So most companies would be thrilled to have one of these opportunities. We have an abundance of opportunities.
So can I ask you what a typical day for Shantanu is?
Well, in terms of a typical day, sometimes too many meetings, so I have to say that. But, I have only myself to blame because I can control my schedule. I like to focus on a couple of areas. I like to focus on products. Are we really focused on product strategy, and what are we doing to further, what we need to do from a product point of view? Customers, I spend a fair amount of my time with customers, because the truth is with your customers, where are we serving them well, where are we not serving them well? And employees, because great ideas, as one of our founders said, come from everywhere in the company. And so I try to do a little bit of all of this, building products and focused on where the company should go, ensuring that we're meeting the needs of our customers, and getting an enlightened and motivated employee base. And I think if you do that, the rest takes care of itself.
Very nicely said. So you were appointed by the President Obama, to be on the advisory board. What was that feeling like?
It's just such a tremendous privilege, to be able to give back and contribute to a country that's given so much to me. I think the key idea was, how can private sector learn from the government and vice versa? And so it was a bunch of CEOs, and our mandate was, how can we help government take best practices that happen in industries and try to apply that in government? And for us, the learning was all about, how do you impact scale at such a change? I think we focused on things like technology and how could you bring technology to bear. I think the president always talked about, why isn't it as easy electronically to get a license or file your tax returns as it is to get a reservation at a restaurant? And I think for the first few years we made some fairly significant contributions, and it's been a lot of fun to really understand what it takes to both help the administration but also the Congress, because as we know, and there's always a little bit of checks and balances, and to some extent you realize that at a company like Adobe, you can actually impact things much easier than maybe you can in government.
And speaking of giving back, you have really tremendously given back. You're also the president of the Adobe Foundation, and you're actually getting an award in November for your contributions to social work. Tell me, how have you spearheaded the Adobe Foundation?
Well, I can take no credit for the Adobe Foundation. I think our two founders, John Warnock and Chuck Geschke, always believed that giving back was a fundamental part of the company. It's something that we've certainly grown, but from day one, well before it became sort of popular for enterprises to give back, Adobe started with that fundamental belief. You know, we like to focus our efforts on Adobe Youth Voices and literacy. We just think anybody who grows up today without access to literacy is going to be underprivileged for the rest of their lives. And it's something that the employees can get passionate about because they're helping kids use the products that they develop. And so the Adobe Foundation is all about, you know, how can we as a good corporate citizen give back, whether it's being green, whether it's using alternate forms of energy, and most important and near and dear, I think, to all of our hearts, how can we make technology more accessible to anybody who has a creative idea to tell.
And you're very modest. You also have given back to many contributions and many organizations. One of them, you know, I met your lovely wife through you being one of the donors, and also she's one of the biggest volunteers of Maitri. How important do you think is successful people for you? How important do you think for successful people like you it is to give back? You are very humble and very under the radar. And you and your wife have contributed to many organizations and many charities, including Maitri, where I met your lovely wife and you for the first time. How important do you think it is for successful people like you to give back?
Well, I think we're very fortunate, and I think giving back to whatever you're passionate about, I think is you know, an obligation and a responsibility that we do have. Rennie is very passionate about education, so she also served on the board of the high school, which I think is great. I mean, you know, kids are our future, and so if there are ways in which we can give back to universities, that's actually been an area of passion for all of us. And as you mentioned, she's on the board of Maitri, which I think is, again, a really important cause. I mean, there's so many great causes that people give to, and I do think it's worthwhile and encourage people to give to whatever cause they believe in, because it's a way to make a difference.
From a very successful man, what would you say is the definition of success for you?
I think success is about having impact. I do like that word impact in terms of, you know, and fulfilling your potential. And, you know, it's been a great journey for me in terms of being able to, you know, have an impact, hopefully, in the world of communication. And to have fun doing it, right? I mean, it's important to have fun and keep all these things in perspective.
And how would Shantanu Narayan like to be remembered?
Well, I hope that's a good one. Well, I think I'd like to be remembered as somebody who's a good person. And I think at the end of the day, if I make a difference in a few people's lives, that'd be great.
Very inspiring. Thank you for your time. We look forward to catching up with you again with many more gadgets and many more products.
Thanks a lot for having me.